question for you. Every kind of couple of months, every year or so, we see celebrations, the naturalization ceremonies. And I think my first question is, how do we get there? Why is it that that's possible for some, but not all of the people that kind of seek citizenship here in America?
Okay. I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about the naturalization process. So the first step in the process is a multi-step process, first and foremost. The first step in the process is filing for your citizenship by filing paperwork with the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. It's called the Form N-400. And so you can either file the N-400 online or you can file it via the paper format. Either way, my recommendation would be, even if you're filing it via paper format, to go on to the USCIS website and create an account. That way you can keep track of the progress of your application. And so before filing the naturalization application, you want to make sure that you're eligible. And so some of the eligibility includes making sure that you are at least the age of 18 years or above. You want to make sure that you've had your permanent residency for at least 5 years, or it can be 3 years if you're married to a US citizen. In addition, you want to make sure you have good moral character, as well as have the ability to prove continuous residency in the US. And so that basically means that you can at least establish that you've been in the US. You have not left the US for over a year in general. And so those are some of the main eligibility requirements in order to file for your naturalization. The next step would be after you submit your application, you will receive a notice from USCIS, and that notice is going to be a biometrics notice, and it will have the specific location, the date and time for you to go into a local USCIS office to do your fingerprinting. At that time, you'll also take a photograph, and they'll take your signature as well. The next step in the process is you would get another notice in which you would have an appointment, in which you'd come into the local USCIS office to do an interview. And at that time, they'll basically sit down with you and look over your naturalization application and ask you questions about the application. And in addition, you would submit to a civics and an English test. With regards to the civics test, there is an opportunity for you to prepare for the civics test by going onto the USCIS website. There's a list of questions, 100 questions to be specific, and those questions really relate to the U.S. government, the history of the U.S., and so they just want to make sure that you have a general understanding or a basic understanding of the U.S. government. And so you'll have an opportunity to also be tested regarding the U.S. civics and the English test, which means that you have to have some basic proficiency in English, the ability to read, write, and speak English. Once you've submitted to the interview process and have done the English and the civics test, the next step in the process would be you'll get your decision from USCIS, and then you'll have an opportunity to come in to do the ceremony and pledge allegiance essentially to the United States. And so that's the general process for naturalization here in this country, in the US.
Can anyone submit that N-400 form, or is there, like, if anyone kind of comes over the border, whichever way that happens, can anyone submit that form?
No, as I mentioned, you do have to meet the eligibility criteria. So specifically, again, it's somebody who has had their green card for at least 5 years, or if you're married to a U.S. citizen, you can apply within 3 years of having your green card. So not just anyone can apply for naturalization. You have to meet the eligibility requirements. And like I said, the basic have the basic proficiency in English, which can be very challenging to many people who are foreigners, of course, especially older people who may not have had the opportunity to learn how to read or write. And so it can be challenging for certain populations for sure.
What about for children, people who are brought to the country as children? How can they kind of get to that process, to that first step of submitting the N-400?
Well, again, you have to be at least 18 years of age. For children, if your parents are petitioning for, or if their parents are petitioning for naturalization, they can also petition for their children as well. And so that's how a child can become a U.S. citizen, is through their parents, their U.S. citizen parents, or excuse me, their parents who are petitioning for citizenship or naturalization. But if a person is looking to petition for themselves, they do have to be at least 18 years of age or older.
Someone that comes over the border illegally, someone that's undocumented in the US, how do they even get that green card? How do they get to that step?
It really depends. First of all, that the process would be extremely lengthy for somebody who just came across the border without any documentation. They would essentially have some form of immigration benefit available to them. Generally, many people petition for their family members, and that form is the I-130. So a person who is married to a U.S. citizen, who has a U.S. citizen child over the age of 21, the child can petition for their relative, or if they have a sibling or a parent who is a U.S. citizen, they could petition for their relative to get their green card. And that's usually the first step in the process, before later on, once, 5 years or 3 years through marriage, of having your green card, then you can apply for naturalization. But generally, somebody who just comes over the border, depending on the country that they're coming from and the benefits that may be available as a result of their home country, depending on what's happening. For instance, there are certain people who come without any type of immigration benefit at all, but they may be fleeing their country due to fear of persecution. And so, for instance, in that case, they may be eligible to apply for asylum within at least 1 year, within 1 year of entering the United States. So you have people who have experienced persecution due to for political reasons, for social status, gender, ethnicity, religious beliefs, and a number of classified reasons. So they could apply for asylum, for instance. That's another way to get your green card. And there are a number of different ways. Sometimes people are sponsored by their employer. And it really just depends. There's a myriad of different ways that people can ultimately get their green card. But the most common ways you'll see is through a family petition. Or for some people, depending on the country that they're fleeing, it could be asylum, for instance, if they're in fear of persecution and returning back to their home country due to safety concerns.
I think there's a little bit of misconception on how long this process takes. And I'm wondering if you've already kind of you said 3 years, 5 years for some. Patience, that doesn't feel like I'm sorry. Patience sounds like something you really need if you're going through this process.
Absolutely. The immigration process is extremely lengthy, and especially post-COVID, it's become a lot longer because of, cuts to staff. There's extreme backlogs in some of the different USCIS processing centers. And so a lot of people, some people may think, that they're going to get a decision right away. And sometimes you're waiting for months or even years to get a decision on a petition that's filed, depending on what that petition is, of course. But it can be extremely lengthy. I've seen cases where people are waiting for probably 10 years. And so it's not uncommon, depending on, how they entered this country, what their status was when they entered, or maybe lack thereof a valid status. It also depends on whether somebody's in removal, seeking termination of removal. So immigration is extremely complex, and it can be, the more complicated somebody's background is, the lengthier the process generally is. And so it can be extremely, extremely lengthy process.
And I know you mentioned having good moral character as a part of this. And within those 10 years, a lot can happen. You can get pulled over for speeding. You could commit a more serious crime. And so in those 10 years, what are some of the things that you do have to kind of take note of? Actually, no, my first question would be, in those 10 years, is it still possible to be deported? And then I'll ask my second one.
Absolutely. Really, especially in light of the current political climate, I would caution anyone who is trying to make sure that they get on track with their immigration status to, try to be a law-abiding individual for the most part. But obviously, things happen. It can be any infraction. It could be, a driving violation, even such as like a DUI, for instance. Those type of things, I would really, really caution people to just be careful, to make sure you're really not having any touches with the law, because anything can affect your immigration case, even if you view it as somewhat innocent or a small issue. And so, definitely. And also, anyone who is arrested or fingerprinted, that immediately goes to, especially if you're a non-citizen, that does go to immigration as well. And immigration enforcement officers would be alerted. Essentially, it puts a red flag on your immigration status. And so, definitely, I'd advise anyone who is going through any immigration process to make sure that you're abiding by all laws to the extent possible.
There's a man in Massachusetts who was just detained by ICE with his 18-year-old son. And we've learned that they were kind of put on their radar after finding out that the father was a repeat, I guess, reckless driver. They said he constantly was speeding around his residential neighborhood. Does it surprise you that something as what we might consider as simple as speeding led to this detention?
It's not surprising at all in light of what's been happening politically. I mean, you have people who, with the most of minor infractions, really, we're seeing people detained, and so it's not surprising. I've been advocating a lot and informing people just to be careful, even domestic situations, driving violations as we're seeing, and honestly, even people who have not had any contact with the law at all are being targeted, just for the mere fact that they're not a U.S. citizen. We're really seeing a lot of due process violations, sadly. We're seeing a lot of racial profiling. We're seeing that people are being targeted, just just by looking like an immigrant. And so, sadly, anything can trigger someone being targeted, but definitely any touch with the law would certainly do it. So it's not surprising.
We know that this man's son was brought into the country from Brazil when he was only 6 years old, still undocumented, considered a DACA recipient, and he was also taken into custody by ICE. And so, my question to you would be: was there anything that they could have done to prevent this from happening? Obviously, we know that they were brought on their radar because of the speeding, but this is someone that was brought here at only 6 years old and had just turned 18. Was there anything that they could have done to prevent him from being detained?
I don't know that there's anything that could have been done to prevent him from being detained, but one thing that I've been advocating, along with my colleagues have been advocating for in the local communities, is just informing parents about family preparedness, making sure that you have a plan in place in the event that you are detained. In this case, in this case, maybe not as applicable, but where people are being separated from their children, you want to make sure you have a plan in place. You've memorized your attorney's number, or at least somebody who can get to your attorney as soon as possible. You've put in certain paperwork. You put important paperwork, especially pertaining to your immigration status or any family planning, in a secure place, so that somebody would be able to easily obtain those documents, so that you have a plan in place in the event that the inevitable happens, that you're detained.
Does ICE have the authority to detain anyone that's undocumented? Because the father was the original target, not the son, and the son allegedly hasn't done anything. So does ICE have the ability to just detain anyone that's undocumented in that vicinity over the age of 18?
Well, it's kind of a complicated. It's not a simple answer, but technically, somebody who is not documented can be detained, essentially. Once someone is detained, obviously you want to access an attorney so that they have the ability to perhaps file a motion for a bond so that person can be released. But generally, you would need to have some type of immigration relief available to you, or something pending, either something approved or something pending, to show that, and in regards to bond motions in general, the two factors that are considered is that somebody is not a flight risk. That's number one, meaning that if you are released, that there's no risk, or at least the risk is extremely minimal that you would try to flee. Number two, that you don't pose a danger to society. And so, that's essentially what would happen once a person is detained. You'd really try to see if you can get an advocate or an attorney to file a motion so that you can be released on bond. But with regards to whether ICE has the authority to detain someone who is undocumented, the simple answer would be yes. If you're not properly documented, you are at risk of being detained and deported and entered into removal proceedings. That's a simple answer, but it really does depend on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you for that. I want to ask about finances. What are some of the financial barriers that might prevent immigrant families from applying, even just applying for citizenship?
Really, a lot of people can't afford it right now. We're noticing that, almost every year the filing fees increase. And so there's been a recent increase right now. If you're filing for naturalization, the price is $710 if you're filing online, $760 if you're filing via the paper format. Some people just can't afford it. There is a waiver available. But even that could be for some people somewhat difficult proving and demonstrating that that they're eligible for the fee waiver. Aside from that, the form is extremely complex. So most people aren't filing, or at least they wouldn't be advisable to file the N-400 by yourself. Generally, you'd want to do that with some type of legal assistance, either through an attorney or a local agency that handles those type of matters. Here in Rhode Island, we have Dorcas International Institute. I know there's also Progresso Latino that may be able to do it for a reduced cost. Nonetheless, it's an extremely complex form. And so hiring, an agency or an attorney, a lot of people don't have the money to do that. If you're hiring an attorney, it could be at least a couple $1,000s. And so that's, out of reach for many people.
What would be your response to anyone that says, why can't you just get your citizenship? Why can't you just do it the right way?
It's not that simple. It's not that simple for a lot of people. There are a lot of barriers. You have some people where English is not their first language. For instance, it's not their native language. And so, in order to apply for citizenship and go through with the process, you do have to demonstrate a proficiency in English, which can be a challenge for people who speak other languages, or, as I mentioned, English is not their first language. We talked about the cost factor, the fact that a lot of people just can't afford even the filing fee, let alone to pay for an advocate to make sure that, or an attorney to make sure that it's done properly. There's also a lot of cultural barriers as well. As I mentioned, a part of the naturalization process is demonstrating basic knowledge of U.S. government and through the civics test. And so that may be somewhat difficult for a lot of people. I'll say, I actually, even as a U.S. citizen myself, I've seen the test, and some of those questions I've looked at like, wow, sadly, I don't even know the answer to all of these questions as an attorney here in the U.S. And so expecting, a foreigner or an immigrant to know a lot of these answers, it can be very, very, it may be, somewhat challenging for many people. So there's a number of different barriers. It's not as simple as just applying. A lot of people don't have access. Some people may not be computer literate. Some people may not be literate at all, especially when you think about a lot of people who are elderly. They may have trouble. They may not even know how to read and write. My grandmother, actually, she did become a citizen, but we had to put her in classes to learn how to read, to learn how to write, in order for her to take the civics test. So a lot of people it may not be that simple to just go ahead and apply for citizenship. There may be a number of barriers where it poses a hardship on individuals. even though they have the desire to do the right thing, it's just not as easy for everyone.
Last question, I'll let you go. And I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to make sure with you. There is no like direct pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients after you apply and is DACA still in effect, or was that only under the Obama administration, that application to get your driver's license, Social Security, that kind of thing? And then when you apply for that, if that's even still a thing anymore, there's no like, okay, this is the next step, the same way you do the green card to N400.
That is correct. There's no next step with regards to becoming a citizen.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I really, really appreciate it. So helpful.